of our members and their partners, and most of them are those who are promoting philanthropic culture in the continent, they informed a shift on how we are conceptualizing philanthropy in the continent. So one, kindly mute yourselves. So one, they made us believe that gender, race, class must be at the center or at the heart of any analysis that we are doing. And this concept of framing then definitely is going to shift our understanding of philanthropic giving in the continent from one that focuses on dealing with consequences of injustice rather than the one that deals with the root causes of inequality. And it gives us a broader understanding of philanthropic giving in the continent that moves beyond money as the only way to think about philanthropy, that enable broader understanding of what it means to resource and sustain movement for change. And it alter all giving in the continent and make us understand that normally the giving is not done only by the wealth people and those with surplus. The giving is done at all levels. And lastly, it also, this conceptual framing is also informing the method we use to produce knowledge. That we really need to use the method that can either continue to, if we can use the method that can continue to benefit the Western frames of understanding philanthropic giving or leverage indigenous knowledge. So we really need to adapt critical tools, critical methodology, and analytical tools, which is very much central to drive towards generating more and better data for telling the tale of African philanthropy and create the balance of stories. So today this is another one of the APN's webinar. We have put together with the aim of creating a safe space for peer learning. Now, more than ever before, there is a need to amplify feminist voices. You will all agree with me. The revolutionary nature of the world begs us to rethink how we organize ourselves and if we are doing it in a way that can truly help us or can truly work towards liberation. We could all use some of the learning and reuse some of the learning. So a discussion on feminists that we are having here today will help us to discuss on tools and strategies where we get to hear from people, African leaders who have been practicing for years and felt fitting. I would also like to take this opportunity to request most of us to mute our mics and also to please share your name, organization, and email address. We really need to share materials from this conversation with you, especially if you are participating in our webinars for the first time. So we have 4 speakers in for our discussion today. Allow me to introduce all of them, and then we will invite them to speak one after the other. And in the end, we are going to have an opportunity to ask questions, but for us to be able to manage this conversation more smoothly, kindly also jot down your questions, comments on the chat. There is a chat that is there for you. And quickly now, let me introduce our speakers. So I will start with Rosabel Kagumire. And Rosabel, please, if feel free to have your camera on. So Rosabel is a feminist writer, award winner, blogger, and a social political commentator. She is the curator and editor of African Feminism, a platform that documents narratives and experiences of African women. Rosabel is also co-editor of a recent release book called Challenging Patriarch. She holds a master's in media, peace and conflict studies from the University for Peace in Costa Rica. She has also done short-term studies in global leadership, public policy, as well as non-violent conflict. Rosabel is speaking with us today from Uganda. The second speaker is Sophie Otiende. Sophie Otiende is a feminist, a teacher, and survivor advocate for human trafficking. She is currently the program consultant for Her Art Kenya. This is Awareness Against Human Trafficking, an NGO working on the problem of human trafficking in Kenya. Sophie is also passionate about storytelling and the power of stories to create change and educate, and fervent activist of ethical storytelling and of Black women writing and documenting about themselves. So another speaker with us today is Sewit Haile Selassie. Sewit Haile Selassie is a feminist blogger and gender specialist. Although formally trained as an economist, she has most of her time working as a researcher and journalist, as well as a consultant to amplify the voices of women and girls. Sewit is also a co-founder of a startup company called Changing Images in Ethiopia, a marketing and communicating company that is dedicated to transformative change. She is currently working on a passion project. Sewit is a principal investigator for a research project funded by School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS University in the UK, that focuses on youth, political participation, and peace building. And another speaker who is with us today is Dina Adiko. Dina Adiko is a feminist and a gender and inclusion specialist with over 18 years experience, working to promote women's rights and gender equality in Ghana. Over the years, Dina has contributed actively towards ending all forms of violence against women and children. She also influenced national level policymaking processes when she was the technical advisor on gender to the Ministry of Gender, Children, and Social Protection in Ghana. Currently, Dina works as a gender and inclusion consultant. Without further ado, allow me now to introduce our today's moderator for today's session, Karen, who is a project manager of the Women's in Philanthropy project by APN in partnership with Africans Women's Development Fund. Kindly mute your mic.
You are nicely registered. Then she has our support.
Okay, great. So Karen, you are welcome. Karen will be our moderator today. I'll come back to you just to close this conversation. And welcome everyone. We are so happy and honored to have you with us. Karen, are you there?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to unmute myself.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I think without further ado, we'll just get right into the speakers. And our first speaker today is Rosabel, and she will start us off with this discussion by telling us about her experience in feminist organizing, what kind of tools and strategies she has used so far, and the challenges she's encountered. Rosabel, the floor is yours. Rosabel, I think you forgot to unmute yourself as well.
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here. I come to the feminist space with a background, a journalistic background. So my passion is storytelling and documenting stories of women and minorities. And I come to this space about voice and the use of our voice, and how do we ensure a voice matters and that we are heard. And we know from history that a lot of women's voices and women's contributions are erased because of patriarchy and other different oppressions that as African women we interface every day. So I come from the background of making sure that our voice is heard, that in the first place we understand why our voice matters, and the fact that we come to this place as women historically marginalized from the public discourse, not to be seen, not to be, you don't have the final say on what happens, and the fact that most of our countries continue to, of course, as a result of long years of colonialism, the colonial states we inherited still marginalizes women, and especially women's voices. And if somebody cannot hear you, I don't think they can include you. So at the end of the day, we have countries where women are seen, but when you look at the kind of contributions they do within the state structure, it's difficult to realize how we have been able to dismantle these forces, because women are just, you know, included to be seen. To be seen to include women becomes like a mark the states tick off, and we say that in the recent book we edited on how states are circumventing the idea of women and their voice. And at the end of the day, women don't have the voice in these structures. They basically, if you're a woman and you don't toe the voice, the main voice, the male voice, then you are out. So I come to that space of organizing around voice and documenting women's stories. My experiences, I'm an editor for AfricanFeminism.com. We basically every day seek out stories of women from different movements across the continent. And in the last few years, we have seen women, especially young women, because we are a continent that has very many young people. And these young people are pushing against old age hierarchies and structures that are putting them in a place that is at a disadvantage and does not give them space. So at the end of the day, young women in this continent are at a much lower ladder when we are talking about voice. So we come from hierarchical backgrounds where age matters. If you're young, and it doesn't matter what you know, you must adhere to certain hierarchies. So I'm about young women's voices and how we continue to listen to them, and how they are actually shaping alternative ways of organizing once they find that the hierarchical way of organizing is also hit the very organizations, women's rights organizations that we find in different African countries. And we see many young people coming up with different alternative ways of organizing and reaching out to each other. And we see, for example, in Kenya, we saw feminists in Kenya organizing against gender-based violence. We see women in South Africa, young women in South Africa, whether from Rhodes Must Fall to Fees Must Fall, young women being instrumental in terms of change, and trying to document that and say we cannot allow the silencing, because women have not just started organizing. Women organized pre-independence, during independence, but often our history, what we teach in our schools right now, does not in any way capture women's histories in our countries. It's only later on, probably at universities, that you can find little bit of that, that women's organizing is actually brought forward. So for me, I'm obsessed with that idea that we have to understand the marginalizations, historical marginalizations, and make sure that we actually assert our power right now.
Okay, thank you for that. I just have a few follow-up questions about what you said. And the first thing, you mentioned about alternative ways of organizing that a lot of women have been using currently that are not in the mainstream. Can you talk about some of those alternative ways a bit?
we honestly see a lot of young women organizing what we call horizontally, and where we realize that you cannot be the only person at the forefront. So across different, bring different talents to the pool. And sometimes this organizing is ad hoc and necessary for certain causes. We saw this, for example, in Uganda when women were killed and kidnapped, and we saw, led by Dr. Stella Nyanzi, very many young women organizing Women's March UG, and very many other pushbacks. At the beginning of this year, for example, young women in Uganda were pushing back against rape culture and outing their rapists. That was powerful. And before, these young women would expect to just go and approach women's rights organizations who could give them the kind of clout that is necessary to face this kind of powerful abusers of power. But I think in that way, to see women using social media as tools that we can reclaim our voice, we don't have to wait for somebody in the mainstream NGO organizing, that we can actually use our platforms and speak back. And once they spoke back, the backlash was there. And we saw a lot of women's rights organizations in Uganda coming through and saying, we have your back. And that's the kind of linkages we need to be seeing, that young women are finding the alternative voices in platforms like Twitter or Facebook, and they're able to create a movement in real time on certain issues that we have not been able to speak about currently as movements in the past. And this is not only happening in Uganda, we have seen in Nigeria, if you followed last year, Nigerian women organizing around young women organizing around church too, and bringing this much needed conversation and confrontation of religion and organized religion, and what happens when churches and religion is not checked, and what kind of violations happen in places of worship, and what is upheld by cultures of oppression within the very structures like religion. So we saw church too, women speaking out about the sexual violence within the churches. And that was unprecedented, at least here on the continent, where we still have religion occupying a very big space in terms of accountability. So we have seen those voices. And unfortunately, of course, Nigerian women are still pushing back. In the last weeks, we have seen a rise in rapes and sexual abuse within this lockdown, COVID lockdown, that we actually hashtags like we're tired, being, young women exposing rapists and telling their stories. And for many people who are not, there are many people who say, but why do you go on Twitter to say this? It's because we have been conditioned to silence, to use, we have cordoned off what is the right means for women to speak about themselves and speak about violence. And for many women, that has not worked. And even when we have women's rights organizations, those channels have not worked, because at the end of the day, the kind of forces we are seeing when you're talking about status quo forces that young women have to face, a lot of times we have to kind of face the fact that what are the limitations of the current, what we see as NGOization of women's rights, and how does that affect our feminist organizing?
Okay, thank you so much, Rosabel, for that insight. I'd just like to remind, so I will try to ask follow-up questions, but I just want to remind everyone to write their questions in the chat so that we can then ask all the speakers at the end. But thank you so much for that. I also just want to remind everyone to please mute themselves when the speakers are speaking, so that they may be heard well by everyone, and so that it doesn't distract them as well. Okay, so we'll then move on to our second speaker for today, Sophie, who's going to give us her insight into feminist organizing and her area of expertise, which has been organizing around human trafficking. Welcome, Sophie.
Thank you so much, everyone, and it's great to see a few people that I know. on the call. That's always a pleasure. So as you've had, I identify as a feminist, and the way I think for me I came across feminism was the fact that after going through an injustice, I was trying to find, words to actually, words, ideologies, something that basically makes sense in terms of the pursuit of justice. And I just couldn't find, so far I haven't found anything that comes close to feminist ideology in basically looking at justice specifically for people that are vulnerable and for people that are marginalized. And also just the introduction to intersectional feminism was also something that completely changed the way I think about the work that I do and the work that I've always done. And in human trafficking and in migration in general, where my expertise is, it's extremely, like, there aren't many female voices, there aren't many Black voices, there aren't many survivor voices that are being listened to. And for me, one of the things in terms of organizing was actually saying that I'm a survivor and saying that survivors actually come in different ways and in different forms and basically have different voices, which is something that in development work has always like broken my heart in the way that survivors are portrayed. Survivors are always portrayed as others, they're always portrayed as people that need help, they're always portrayed as people that basically cannot speak for themselves, always portrayed as people that cannot define justice from themselves, rather require other experts to define what justice looks for them. And for me, being a feminist and being a survivor has been a constant journey of saying that, we need to have a different narrative, especially even when we are talking about healing, when we are talking about justice. We need to negotiate, we need to redefine some of the ways we speak about justice, especially thinking about the fact that the systems of justice and most of the systems that have been placed are not necessarily feminist. They're not necessarily considering the most vulnerable person in the group. And even when feminist organizing sometimes it's done, and I know Rosabella has touched on this, in mainstream organization and mainstream CSOs, we see the same replication of the same trends, injustices, the same framing of people that patriarchy does. So for me, it's been a constant conversation of how do we dismantle that in a way that makes sense and in a way that we are also creating new systems. And for me, my journey in this has also been asking if we are saying, for example, something like, we don't like the way African stories are told. What is our answer? What is our answer in terms of this is how African stories are supposed to be told? So for me, it's been my journey has been a constant journey of criticizing and also wanting to teach, also wanting to say that it's not enough to say that this is what is wrong. We have the capacity to imagine new systems. We have the capacity to imagine new ways of doing things, especially in places in the field, for example, in the field that I am, trafficking, where most of it is just filled by white savior complex and patriarchy and people that just basically think that vulnerable people or people that go through abuse do not have brains to, to essentially say what they want. An example of, for example, the whole conversation around migration and the fact that migrants are making, they're making reasonable decisions based on their circumstances. People want to make it sound like things like migration, even just within our countries, even just across the border, people want to make it sound like it's a crisis and that people are not making these decisions from a place of, reasoning, from a place of these are my circumstances, these are the options that I have. And so this is what I need to do. And for me, it's been a constant conversation of that. Something else that, again, I'm quite passionate about is also just making sure that the women that are occupying the places, because I've been having this conversation with people in terms of feminism and how far we've come and the spaces that feminists occupy. So it's a question of I occupy a certain position in my organization, somebody else occupies another position. And if we are not working together, if we are not also not monitoring the places that we have, the power structures, you know, the battles that we've already won as feminists, and how we basically want to, how we can, you know, use the spaces that we've already won to push for further spaces, is something that is I'm constantly thinking about, especially in my industry, and even when we're talking about politics. And as Rosabel was saying, for me, organizing has mainly been very ad hoc. It's been very, you know, not formally organized things. It's been mostly us organizing, sitting with women that I know are working in different spaces and asking the relevant question. When something happens in the news, if I know that so and so works at a radio station, instead of basically first of all starting to write something publicly, I reach out to them and I'm like, have you seen what your station has done? So for me, that has also been something that I've seen as effective, that us basically monitoring the spaces right now that are occupied by feminists and holding them accountable and teaching them. Because for me, what is also heartbreaking for me right now is the question of what are the spaces for learning in feminism? Because when we hold, much as we are keen on holding people accountable, we should also be very keen on teaching, very keen. And there's teaching that exhausts. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people that genuinely want to understand, young feminists that no longer don't have the access to the books, the theory, the everything that we have, and just want to know and want to find the language to basically speak and live and work in the spaces that they are. And like, I'm very, very passionate about the workplace also as a place of feminism, because we spend so much time. Capitalism has made sure that we spend 90% of our time working. So if workplaces are not feminist, they don't reflect feminist principles, we are not going to break down some of the things that we actually want to break down. And for me, working with feminist professionals has also been something that I'm actively trying and asking questions, you know, like it's one thing to come and sit on a webinar like this and say, you know, I'm a feminist and what, but if I come to your workplace, is your department feminist? Are you trying to push some of the agendas that we are speaking about? And also just talking to young feminists and telling them this is how we live out our feminism. Like any other ideology, we need to teach people how to practice feminism. And for me, yeah, that's, I guess, where I am.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So I think actually before I ask my question, I just want to mention quickly that Musa commented that they fully agree with your comments on white savior narrative. Our stories, voices are mistold and misrepresented. Pertains to when you were talking about white savior narratives in migration. Okay, so I'm just curious, and you kind of mentioned it towards the end slightly about teaching that is tiring versus teaching practical ways of practicing feminism to young women that are eager. And could you expound on that a little bit? Because especially when you talk about survivors telling their own stories, how do you ensure that they have the space to be autonomous and talk about what they want and how they want to be represented without then making it their responsibility to teach people?
I think we can't talk about survivors telling their stories without talking about justice, without having survivors, first of all, define justice for themselves and ensuring that they find that justice and we push for them to actually get that justice. Because it's by finding justice, that you can find, the independence to speak out about different things. So for me, it's, when it comes to trauma and survivors, it's a difficult, I cannot say that we have the answer. I basically have a complete answer here, but it's a journey. It's a journey of us constantly. First of all, survivors are different. Each survivor is going to define justice differently. And we have to be open to the fact that survivors will define justice differently. And one of the struggles I've basically had working where I am is the fact that justice has always been defined within the legal justice system. So that we have a perpetrator who is evil and basically is the one that basically we need to arrest and put in jail, and that's it, and survivors are supposed to be happy about that. But in my years of working with survivors, I found out that, survivors basically don't need, there are survivors who the criminal justice system is not even the first priority, and they'll never ever want to pursue it. And we have to find those ways. We have to be willing to say that if someone comes to us, justice, their definition of justice is the most important one, regardless of what you've been taught in school. I just think that that's the first thing. And once they've defined that justice, working with them and basically helping them pursue that justice. Does it mean that we'll always get that justice? No, we won't always. The reality is we won't always get it, but because we are on that journey, it's very easy for someone to then understand what their power is and what they have there, what they can take control of. And in terms of telling stories, we've always told the same stories about survivors, always told the same, what is this? What happened to you? It's a definition of what happened to you, and basically detailing the abuse over and over again. I've never understood what it is, because as soon as you say someone has been raped, it should be enough, for you to have an imagination of exactly what happened. We've sort of put ourselves in this, I'm not sure, this trend where we basically have to listen to very grueling details of survival to empathize with people. And I think for me, empowering survivors, working with survivors on their journey, and then them deciding the story that they want to tell. And some of the survivors I've worked with don't want to talk about their abuse. Some of them want to talk about different things, and us listening basically will make it easier for us to stop asking the question of what story is to be told. Because I think that each of us want different. If I asked you right now, in your whole life, what part of your story do you want to be told? You'd be happy to pick whichever part you want to pick, but survivors never get that choice. 90% of the time, the choice that they get is the story of the abuse, is what is told, is what they live with every single day. So moving out of that and basically saying that the one, and for me, this is where the whole aspect of storytelling and the whole aspect of storytelling being powerful is important, is the fact that as soon as we see survivors as people, as not others, as someone that could, and in feminism, it's easy because all of us, in most of the time on this call, everyone possibly knows a friend of theirs that was raped, or that went through sexual abuse. And it is sad, we do. And so you can, at a basic level, you can be able to understand that abuse happens to anyone and happens to different kinds of people. So I think the other narrative that needs to now come is also the fact that this abuse basically happens because there are certain people in the community that look like us, because we always make it sound like perpetrators, I don't know. And for me, again, it's the framing of the criminal justice system that I have a huge problem with, where we like to other survivors and we also like to other perpetrators. And by doing that, what we end up doing is that we are not addressing the fact that we are responsible, one, for protecting survivors, and we are also responsible for holding perpetrators accountable. So for me, pushing for survivors to tell their story is also ensuring that the story of the fact that perpetrators are part and parcel of us is told. And that the highlight, especially when it comes to abuse, moves away from the survivor and goes to the perpetrator. You know, why are you abusing? Why are you not, you know, why are you doing what you're doing?
Thank you so much, Sophie, for that clarification. Someone, their name is E. Calavera, and they've commented, I think also some survivors want to take an active role of educating others, and others want to share their story to encourage others. Thank you for that comment. Okay, so before we move on to our third speaker, I just want to point out that someone earlier asked about a book that Rosebell edited, and she has very graciously posted the link to that book in the chat. So for all of you that want to go read that book, the link is right there, and it's in PDF format. We have another comment from Joyce that has said, great point, read the workplace of a feminist must reflect their course. Great, okay, thank you. So now we're gonna move on to our third speaker, and that is Sewit, and she will also talk us through her experience in feminist organizing and tell us about her expertise and kind of what she's learned and what tools and strategies she's employed so far. So welcome, Sewit.
Thank you, Karen. I'm having a battle with my bandwidth right now, so it's better if I don't turn on my camera, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's okay.
Can you hear me?
You were going in and out in the beginning, but we'll try our best.
Great. Yes. Today is an unusual battle with my internet connection. My apologies in advance for anything that may happen after this point as well. Today I was at an office, and I was asked about my background, which was I have a background in economics, and I've come in and out of many professions, but working on feminist issues and gender issues has stuck. And somebody asked me why I chose that path, and my very short answer was basically because none of the world that was narrated to me through my academic background or the work that I was doing made sense without a feminist lens. So I didn't use actually the word feminist in that conversation because feminist is still considered a bad word in my context. So you have to watch how you label yourself and who you label yourself feminist to, which is unfortunate because I would prefer to hold it up as a banner and walk around, because that is my lifestyle, that's my theoretical lens, and that's also how I do my work, which is through the feminist lens. I'm currently coming into a position as managing director for Urian Solutions, a feminist social enterprise that was founded in Ethiopia. But even throughout my career before, I would volunteer and work with various
Sarah, I think we've lost you.
And work as a trainer.
Sorry, I think we've lost you completely. We can't hear you anymore now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. I'm not sure where I stopped, but basically today's presentation, I would want it to be on the usual conversations I have regarding feminism, feminist consciousness, and women's rights with the different people that I come into contact with through my job. And usually there is a question whether or not in my context there is such a thing as a feminist movement. And that is an important question. The entire screen has frozen.
Are you there, Sawit?
Yes, I'm in and out. I don't know how much you've heard.
You were talking about feminist consciousness being. Yeah, you were talking
Yes.
about feminist consciousness, sorry.
My apologies. There is some sort of area-wide issue with bandwidth right now. What I was saying is there is an important conversation to be had in my context about feminist movements or women's movements. Whether or not they exist is a debatable issue, or whether or not they've already existed. And it's important when we're having this conversation within my context to discuss the different nuances of what it means to have a feminist movement and what it means to have a women's movement. And usually I throw the question back at my audience on whether or not they have experienced or know of a woman that might exhibit feminist identity. And usually there are lots of histories and stories from the distant past as well as from our history in general, where there are accounts of fierce women that have dared to challenge the status quo and successfully done so. And these are Ethiopian women's heads of state. These are women who have led conquests at the head of armies. And these are women that have fought for the rights of small villages, women of that one odd woman in their lives that have influenced their perception of equality and what it means to be a feminist. And this comes because feminism, the identifying as a feminist is such a taboo subject for many that you have to pull out those stories from the people that have experienced them through either hearing secondhand or actually observe the lived experience of these women that are challenging the status quo, and to completely transform the feminist. And I enjoy having these conversations because talking about the different feminisms, people are quick to volunteer anecdotes or stories about their own personal history and triumphs of the women in their lives. And I think for men and women alike, this is an important part of the learning and raising a feminist consciousness, at least in my experience. So in my personal encounters, both personally and professionally, it's important for me to have these conversations and pull out these anecdotes and stories that will highlight that while these women continue to be outliers, and there are unique cases, which I'll come back to, why there hasn't been a critical mass or a momentum in that feminist consciousness, there are exercising dissent against the norm, dissent against the mainstream. And it's a result of a spark of feminist consciousness in these women's lives. But still they are labeled as outliers or unique cases or aberrations or crazy or odd or unnatural or maybe worse things because they have done the unthinkable of challenging tradition, norms, and demanding for their own rights through their own voices. These women are, of course, systematically erased from history and mentioned only in passing as these oddities in families' histories or in a nation's history, or they are highlighted as a supporting role to the men in their life. So it's never about the woman's individual understanding of how her lived experience has been disadvantaged because she's a woman. It has to do with something else. For example, we have an Empress Taitu, which I am convinced is the ultimate feminist, and there is only a recognition of this woman as her supporting role to her husband, the emperor. But then you look at history quite closely and you see that this woman was actually a co-regent. But wrapping your head around that within this context could be quite challenging. So these sparks of feminist consciousness in the mundane, in the everyday, as well as in the grandiosity of state affairs are really important, because it's important to highlight these women existed and do exist. So that makes me a continuity of that feminist consciousness, not something that's foreign, that's brought in from elsewhere, but rather something that has existed and will continue existing as a uniquely Ethiopian or African feminist consciousness. It's important to keep highlighting that they existed, that we exist, and that it has happened, that pushback has happened. The questions of women's rights have been raised, and there's no outside or foreign ideas within those historical contexts or within the small villages our grandmothers have lived in and have raised those questions over and over again. They have reacted to the injustice of living amidst inequality, and they have fought back, and we are fighting back as a continuity of that consciousness. But then there's also another important question to ask. Well, there are individual cases and stories that come out, and not well-documented stories, I might add. Why haven't the sparks of feminist consciousness caught fire? Why hasn't there anything substantial enough for it to be labeled a feminist movement or a women's movement within this context? Why hasn't it hit that critical mass to ensure that it can be nothing but recorded in our history and in our news? And the answers are very complex to get into, and half of it can probably be speculative because not enough has been done to study this. But I keep taking note of the lack of communication between the different contexts within such a diverse setting. Forget cell phones, social media, the internet in general, but even experience sharing among the different lived experiences of women throughout the country is a rarity, which is important to bring women together for that consciousness to grow. Which brings us to the next point, which is networking. There's a transformative impact when women come together, and it's vital that women have space to critically question their own lived experiences and share those lived experiences, and that does not really have a space either. And storytelling that comes with it, whether it's published storytelling or articulated storytelling through women's own voices, who keeps our histories as women, and what are the lenses that interprets those lived experiences and histories? The standpoint of the storyteller really matters, and the previous speakers have both mentioned it. How lived experience is articulated and communicated really matters, and who is telling those stories of these fierce women, these fierce warriors that we have in our past, and the current women that are still questioning, that are still pushing back and fighting for justice. Those spaces are still forming with the introduction of social media, with the introduction of blogging spaces. That's still a space that is yet to form. And that's due to legal barriers to organizing that have existed in different forms in the past. Laws and policies that are put in place to stifle political dissent in general, but also inhibit the platform for women's rights to build that critical mass for a movement. And then finally, because of those limitations, the space for dialogue, these kinds of conversations are also limited, and the space for learning from other contexts are also limited. There's also another thing that I feel is really important to call out, because women's organizations, while they don't identify as feminists, exist in this context in Ethiopia. However, we don't call out the challenges of these organizations. They're labeled anti-tradition, culture, religion, men, call it whatever hat that it's currently wearing, just because of that pushback that the patriarchy resistant enabled. Educated women are the ones that get to articulate and have access to these literatures that and thoughts actually help them think this. It could be labeled a foreign, which is like, as I backtrack, there's the stories of women in the past before donors or foreign who clearly I outlined that these consciousness existed before there was any other influence in this context. But one of the most important that we don't say out loud is the patriarchal structures within women's organizations and the hierarchical structures within women's organizations that to me are very baffling, because it is counterintuitive to have those structures in a women's right or a feminist organization. Fundamentally because those between younger women, older women, women, while might benefit in the mainstream or might be relevant in the mainstream, each lived experience is relevant in it's really too important about that patriarchal influences in the way that lead these organizations, in the way that these structures are set up, because I believe that this is one of the major inhibiting factor and discouraging to have younger women with a feminist consciousness, with the capacity to influence and affect positive. It's discouraging for these young women to join these organizations and to build upon the experiences of the past. I think I should take questions after this point. Hopefully you've heard some of that.
Thank you. It got a lot better towards after the first couple of minutes, so we have heard you. I hope everyone else did as well. Thank you so much. I think just to keep with time, we're gonna move on to the next speaker, and then we'll come back with questions at the end. But thank you so much, for that insight on feminist movements and on women's organizations and the intersection between the two. So for our last speaker, I'd like to invite Dina. Dina, the floor is yours.
Hi, Karen. Thanks for the opportunity. And I'm excited to see quite some friends here. And I see my mentor, Dr. Esther Feaboaji, here as well. And much of what I'm going to say, she trained me. So I'm very glad she's here. And I think it's all in the spirit of supporting the young ones. The question you asked me to speak to is, what is your experience or my experience organizing feminists? And I'll start from the angle of how feminism is perceived. First and foremost, and I think in every part of the world and in Africa, feminism is not welcome. The movement is not welcome. It is perceived as a sinful group or network, and it is perceived as a group of bitter women who are unfulfilled, who are disappointed, and so it's a no-go space. It's seen as a feminist is perceived as a person who hates men. Feminists are also perceived as people who will not or who cannot get married or who will not be able to be married. So in regards to that, it's a movement, it's an ideology that a lot of people, even if we're interested, shy away from. So how do we get ourselves to do the work we do and to self-disclose that we are feminists, to be proud about it and to hold our banner high? It also was interesting to know how we would get a lot of young people to join the movement, especially young women. So we started asking the question. I asked myself the question in the early 2000s when I really got to understand this, is how do people become feminists, proudly feminists, join the movement and advocate for the change we desire? We cannot have the change if we do not know what we're about. So many of the things is, how do we make this attractive to people? And I convinced myself that knowledge was key. It was important for people to understand what it is we're fighting for. Why is the status quo problematic? Why is it that there's an issue with the way women's bodies are perceived? Why is it that there's an issue with the narrative around rape and how we perceive it and the questions we ask around rape? Why is that problematic? Why are the stereotypes about men and women problematic? Why are the expectations that women should do domestic work and hold back from accelerating in their career problematic? We needed that discourse. We needed that. We need to understand what gender biological roles of women, so and why it plays against us in some cases. So when we take it from there, it becomes very easy to get a lot of people committed to the action and to support it in the way that we need to build that critical mass, to build the momentum that we seek, and to push the barriers down. So it's been very interesting, a very interesting journey. I have therefore come at it from the angle of training and capacity building and capacity strengthening and nurturing and all of that. I may be young, in my early 40s, but I have done quite a bit with my younger sisters and younger brothers, and focused a lot more on deconstructing, reconstructing, dismantling the structures through information and awareness creating. It's not been easy. There's been a lot of labeling around it. There's been a lot of criticism around it. We began this from calling it women's empowerment, all sorts of beautiful names so that it could open up. Many people have criticized this approach over time and said, oh, you people were afraid of what you were doing, but also, what are the strategies to get people to listen? It's been very important. What strategies do you employ to get people to listen? How do you even get people together? Note we come from a system where women have to be given permission to go for meetings. They have to be given permission from some other people. It could be their husbands or their fathers or their homekeepers or whoever their managers were, to go for meetings, ordinary meetings in the evening. We are looking at communities, local communities. So therefore, if people resisted the agenda for which you were calling the meeting, they were not going to allow them to come. So it was very critical that we strategize around how to mobilize women and how to give them the understanding and then create a platform for voices to build. So that was also one approach around how to get the message across. How do we mobilize? And then it was very important that we explained what it is that was wrong with the system. Note, and as much as we were victims of the system, not many of us identified what was really wrong with the system and how we could come together to fix. So I came at it from the level of nurturing and capacity and building my own capacity and learning from each other. And it's been interesting. You would also note that traditional media has been very cautious on how much space was given or is given to feminism and the feminist movement. However, we have been fortunate to have social media. And then social media came and the spaces have been open wide. It is not to say that there has not been a lot of attack. I have seen so many vicious attack at women for coming together to voice and criticize what is wrong with the system and how to get it right. Some of it has been so vicious that some people have been called back by their families not to continue the kind of activism they carry on social media. But I will say proudly that particularly in Ghana, where I am and I'm familiar with, a lot of women have been active, have given themselves a voice, and have created spaces for others to build upon. I'll cite example of two groups in Ghana that are on social media, very active, very loud. We have the Pepper Dems Ministry, and if you're on Facebook now, you could check them up. They have played with the narrative. They've flipped it, they've thrown it at people, they've stirred the boats, they've made people so uncomfortable. They have been attacked so viciously, but we're proud to say that this group has stood and they have had our support and we continue to build on. There's another group we call, that is in Ghana, we call our collective vagina. Don't go there. The kinds of things they're proud to talk about and to raise attention to has helped us. If not for anything at all, we've pursued the issues on rape, for example, to the point that it is not easy for people to continue to have a field day in talking about women's body. That hasn't said that it's gone away, but it's been and run for their money. And then we have issues around cooking and what cooking and domestic chores and caregiving role does for women. And the fact that we're beginning to interrogate those societal arrangements and then raise the issues and give women the hope and the confidence that they can do more with their lives than being domestic hands. So these things have played out. It sounds like, oh, so much achievement in over a short period, maybe 10, 20 years, but no, it's not been that easy. But we are clearing enough grounds. And I think one of the things that is emerging again on the scene is the fact that we're talking about how do we care for ourselves as people. How do you self-care? How long can you run? And when do you take a pause and break and reflect? We are women and we've been socialized to be the superheroes of our homes. Though nobody rewards it, nobody acknowledges, some way, somehow, we have been conditioned to understand and believe that we are supposed to be superheroes. We're supposed to run endlessly. We're supposed to take care of everybody and everything. It is our pride that we step out there declaring how much we're able to address in our lives and the lives of the people around us. But it is also important that we at a certain point agree that we're human beings. And there are times when we break, there are times when we reflect, and there are times when we declare and disclose that we cannot just do everything by ourselves. We need help. So these conversations this is how feminism kind of looks like in Ghana. Voice is growing, we're coming together, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unconsciously. Before we realize, we mobilize around an issue, we demand for justice, we create awareness, we call out people, and we say we are not having it. We are still way behind, but we are much better than where we started. So Karen, that's how, I know I'm watching our time and I see we have just a few minutes for further discussions.
Hey, thank you so much, Dina. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the other three speakers as well for all your insight. And I think I now want to open the floor and the chat for anyone that has a question. It can be a general question to all the four speakers, or if you want to ask one to a specific speaker, please just mention that in your question. E. Calavera commented that they have been an avid follower of PDM and that they are amazing. Thank you for that comment. I think, so just as I wait for everyone to kind of ask their questions in the chat, I have a question that's open to all four of the speakers, and I just want to talk about, I'm curious. So two of the speakers talked about feminist organizing in a more ad hoc way. And that is Rosebell and Sophie. And I feel like and Dina talked about it in a more via organization, so a more like systematic kind of way. And I want to know how the two forms of organizing can kind of help each other. And maybe to start with either Rosebell or Sophie. So what are the tangible ways that women's organizations could offer help to young women that are organizing in what we consider alternative ways? And I remember Rosebell mentioning when women went on social media to kind of speak up against things, when women's organizations came and said that we have your back. And I'm curious, what does that actually look like? Yeah.
Can I start?
Yeah, sure.
I definitely think that there's definitely a role that the more organized organizations can be able to help. But one of the things that, again, I would want to, first of all, before even saying that, is also highlight there are some of the things that Rosebell actually mentioned before. And I'll speak about, as my experience is strictly from a Kenyan point of view. In my experience, mainly with feminist organizing in quote unquote, mainly women rights organizations and organizations that call themselves feminists, and the problem is taking over the narrative from the people that basically had been doing this and not giving credit. not giving credit to the activists, to the people on the ground that have been doing all the work, and simply just swooping in because you have a lot of money from a donor who has a specific target and 3 years or 2 years for you to do this, when some of the activists who are on the ground are doing this for their, are doing this every day, are doing the labor every day. I think there's a lot of healing, a lot of conversation and renegotiation of how the mainstream, feminist movement and ad hoc feminist movement is operating, and it's going to take time, but definitely right now the money is and the systems are with the mainstream, feminist organizing, because most of the activists on the ground sometimes will not have funds, resources, or cannot fully dedicate their whole time in doing the feminist work. They cannot fully dedicate that time, mainly because of resources. Of course, there are tables also that mainstream feminist organizations are occupying that they could use to amplify some of the work, some of the things that, activists on the ground are doing. But for me, it's extremely important that an authentic voice is maintained. And to be honest, more and more, the more I look at most of, and I say this as a criticism also to myself, because I'm in an organization and I work for an organization. And my problem has constantly been the fact that organizations co-opt messages and then end up not giving credit to the people that basically started the whole conversation. So I think there's definitely a way in terms of amplification, in terms of resource mobilization, and in terms of the spaces that mainstream of organizations occupy that could amplify whatever ad hoc work is being done. But I'm more inclined, of course, when it comes to feminism, to the ad hoc work, because most of the people that I meet like that are more authentic. They're more authentic in the sense that they're not doing this because they're getting paid. They're not doing this because it usually comes from a place of pain. It comes from a place of suffering. It comes from a place of, I'm defining this for myself. And I think that is the work that feminist organizations need to do. They need to come to a place where, how is this part of, because as soon as women's rights, work became mainstream as part of development work and everything, it just adapted all the negative things that are in mainstream civil society. Only with the fact that this work is directly done for women or is directly done for vulnerable groups. So for me, how to recover would be the culture of mainstream organizations needs to change. They can amplify, they can do that. And I think someone mentioned about movements and the fact that I also don't think that we really need to, I come from as the school of thought that doesn't believe that the feminist movement needs to be homogeneous. It doesn't have to be. I think there's joy in listening to people doing it differently. I think we are attacking the same thing, and there's joy in me sometimes sitting down and listening to somebody else speak with a different voice. So we also have to criticize our definition of movements and how movements operate and how effective they are. I think for me, I want to spend my energy more on effectiveness rather than how each of us is performing our feminism. How effective are we really? How effective is our strategy? If you are effective in a feminist organization where you are probably the head or anything, or you're doing that, I think it's fine. But I think we need to sort of also understand the fact that the way this is being portrayed, and I think this unity, the idea of unity, the idea of women don't work together has really been used against women, that we are not working together simply because we are not sitting on the same table and talking to each other. I am aware, for example, of the work that Rosabel does in Uganda. I might not be working with her directly, but vision is to be able to see a bigger picture and recognize that we are working towards, the same goal, even if we are not constantly checking up on each other and basically saying the same thing.
I wanted to kind of add on to that. I think that there are definitely issues that we need to critically look at, especially in this moment where we see worldwide push for what I can call a revolution in the making, that these marginal voices and marginal ideas have been forming for decades. And right now, what we see as protests against police brutality, racial injustice, against power and hegemony of power, where our organizing finds itself that often that the mainstream is responding to donors than the people, than the realities on the ground. When the reality shifts, the donor takes 9 months to recognize that the reality has shifted, and therefore you have to continue doing the things the same way, and that is no longer really sustainable. It's long overdue with the pressures of COVID-19 and where we have found ourselves, plus the current revolution from Black Lives Matter shows you why this has been long overdue. And this is the conversation: how is the mainstream organizing, feminist organizing, going to actually bring these marginal pushes that have been on for a while for reform, for changes, for complete overhaul, some of the ideas that there is, especially how the feminist organizing holds power within the mainstream. How do you mimic, for example, in many states, in many countries, it's unfortunate that we mimic the organization of the state. It's like there's a director, and then there's like hierarchical power that is so unquestionable that many young people find like that structure very impenetrable, so that new ideas don't even come through. So what we have is like old organizations continuing the same old rights they've always pushed. And what happens is that they're not opening up to the ways, because there's always another person that is being subjugated. Whether you're working on girls' rights, on marriage, on forced marriage, there's always new ways rights are being violated and new groups that are demanding for their rights. And what is usually perturbing for us to think about is also that this kind of hierarchical and being responsible for the donor than the situation on the ground is that we see right now the people at the forefront across Africa at pushing feminist organizations to rethink queer people, LGBTQ rights. And we can learn a lot in how they have actually organized in countries that they're totally illegal. I hear you when you say that I am in a context where I can't say I'm feminist, but imagine for minorities, for LGBT rights, where the law does not even recognize them, that they exist, right? But your hardship is that socially you cannot be recognized as a feminist, that you'll find a problem. I see that, but I think we have a lot to learn from LGBTQ rights across the continent, and the kind of changes, the kind of, I think, progress they've had registered over the last decade in countries that are still really criminalizing their lives, right? So how are we actually opening up to see that actually there are so many people organizing, and yet we are still marginalizing them even within the very movement. I remember working on a couple of issues like abortion, and how abortion up to now, no matter how much we have been pushing, is still seen as something too controversial for women's rights organizations, right? Like, these are very things that, and what happens that the people that are pushing for these kinds of rights are doing it on the margin rather than in a given organization. And organizations, definitely, this is a moment, it's a watershed moment to rethink what power is. How can you lead differently? Not a hierarchical, I'm the boss and you have to say this and I have to be the vision holder, but that there are so many ideas out there that you can benefit from. I think people organizing on ad hoc basis or also under really, really terrible conditions can offer you insights on how they're actually managing to bring about progress in different countries. The other part was on, I think, like, for me, Black Lives Matter having been established by 3 Black women, it shows you, and right now they are not, it's everywhere in the world, right? It's not, this is my idea and I hold it, and because that's not how pushing for a revolution or liberation works is that you bring ideas, and these ideas, if they find fertile ground, that they're going to change face. If Black Lives Matter comes to Africa, how does it look like? It might look different from the Black Lives Matter in the States, but they are still very much related. And how these women can actually have a kind of what they call horizontal leadership, that someone can go in another state and establish a Black Lives Matter and have a chapter where they're actually pushing. So how are we finding these alternative ways of organizing that spread, that we have enough women who can lead? Then they don't have to lead in the mainstream way, or I'm the boss and you're here and you're answerable. I think that is very important. For me, that's very important. It's a watershed moment, definitely. We must change, we must plan and adapt to what's happening in the world, in Africa.
Thank you, Sophie and Rosebell. Before we move on, the question I asked was directed at all four speakers. So if anyone else wants to chime in, if not, I can just ask the next question on the chat. Okay, so E. Calavera asked to the speaker from Ethiopia, when we question hierarchical structures in feminist organizations, are we saying we should abolish the titles? For example, executive director, etc., or what would feminist organizations' organograms look and operate like under the principles that we believe in? And I believe Rosebell spoke about that towards the end as well, about those titles and that kind of structure. But if Sarah, if you want to chime in as well.
Yeah, I was actually thinking that the two questions in terms of whether or not informal feminist organizations and formal women's organizations, and how the two should support each other. I think there was another question about government-run women's movements and experiences there. And I want to reflect on both, on all three questions at once, perhaps. I don't talk. If a women's organization or a feminist organization with that particular objective is not able to live those principles in the way that they manage and lead their organizations, then I think that is to be tackled through feminist methodology, such as a real reflection and learning, and with an attitude of learning towards solving these challenges. If an organization that labels itself feminist still operates with based on age-based hierarchies or class-based hierarchies, then it does not take into the account. It hits us from our fullest potential. For me, that is self-defeating. And perhaps disruption is one path to take in that regard. The other thing that I was reflecting on was how more established feminist organizations can support younger or ad hoc organizing. And in the organization that I was with for 3 years between 2017 and 2019, what I really pushed for is to identify and promote as many of these initiatives as possible, because one of the things that an organization that's well established and well funded can do is to augment these voices and to give a platform for the work that they are doing. And I think that can make a lot of difference in terms of accessing funding, in terms of even gaining visibility. Another area is, of course, the question about how to alternatively fund these informal organizings. And again, Rosabelle may have mentioned that there are a lot of innovations that are not necessarily accessible throughout the movement, but that do exist in terms of accessing funding and organizing within context where it's not really convenient or feasible to organize. It's really, I think I lost the third question that was being asked. Maybe I'll get back to it.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah, for that. I'm going to read some of the comments that that have been posted, and then we can, and then I'll ask another question that's here as well. So Beatrice and Jerry says, I think there needs to be a radical disruption in the
Hello,
women's
Karen.
rights. Oh, yes. Yeah. Okay, I'm not sure who that was, but I'll continue for now. I think there needs to be a radical disruption in the women's rights
Karen, can you hear
organization.
me?
Yeah, now I can.
Oh.
Dina, do you want to continue? Okay. So Beatrice tells us that there needs to be a radical disruption in the women's rights organizations who act as gatekeepers of feminism, but in reality are perpetrators of exclusion, lacking in intersectionality and locking out younger generation feminists. And we've kind of covered, that kind of covers the basis of what the three of you have talked about now with creating platforms for activists who have been on the ground that have been working on this for years and years and who probably have better and deeper insight, as well as the hierarchical structures in organizations and how if that's not effective, then that might not be the best way to go. Dina, are you back? Do you want to move to comment?
Yeah, I'm back. What did I miss? I'm sorry. Karen, I can't hear you. I think you're mute. Yes.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay. We were talking about the comment about radical disruption in women's rights organizations, which kind of summed up the three points that Rosabelle, Sarah, and Sophie were just talking about.
Oh, okay. I sorry if I go back on anything they had already said, but I think I agree with the angles that had been introduced. Some have said these organizations have served as gatekeepers for perpetrating all forms of injustice and suppression against women anyway. So what is the point? I also believe that to any activity, there should be a structure. So then these hierarchy, and pardon me, I missed quite a bit of that conversation when it started. So I'm not sure if I'm going through the wrong door, but these organizations and structures are required to a certain point. It is what they do with these structures that matters. Many of us were groomed, were developed out of such systems, and they have served good purpose. But as time goes on, and given the swift and the change around us today, it's important to interrogate how those spaces continue to support our work or hold back our work. I would not say outright that we should dismantle these hierarchies, but I would say we should interrogate what they stand for, and then we should be open to the other efforts and advocacy strategies that are emerging around us, and we will be fine. I think the intention for many advocates, as we call ourselves today, is to see change in the system, is to work down and dismantle the structures that hold women back and that impose a lot of restrictions on us. So how we do that is important. I think Rosabelle initially said that we cannot continue to go in the way that we think we have to be organized, we have to be homogeneous. I think it's Rosabelle who said that we cannot all be singing the same chorus. But what is important is whatever angle we are singing it from, are we part of the rhythm? And what is that rhythm? Is that rhythm about us securing justice, promoting equality, and ensuring that women are liberated to continue to contribute to our development? And I think that is what the priority should or ought to be. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dina. So I'll move on to the next question. And someone has asked, they would like to know, would like to know if anyone has experienced a national women or feminist movement, and I'll add in initiative, in their country backed by the government or states, actors, and how this played out. I think you guys touched on it, but if you want to kind of elaborate.
Hi, Karen.
Yeah.
Afi is from Ghana. It's just a friend of mine. And I think we all want to know what's happening elsewhere. In Ghana, to the best of my knowledge, there's none like that. And so we're asking if the other panelists have such experience that they can share, so that we probably begin to look forward to an opportunity like that in Ghana.
I wanted to share one kind of reflection on that point. There's a very good interview by Winnie Byanyima, who's the current head of UNAIDS, who is from Uganda and was part of the struggle. I call it struggle. When President Museveni took over power, and she was in the parliament, and she occupied such powerful positions before falling out with the regime. And when they came to power as former rebels, they concentrated on consolidating women's support, because the previous government had not seen that as an important constituency. So when you go across Uganda, many women will tell you right now in the rural area, they will tell you that Museveni brought them freedom, right? It's not even like the women who worked. And that is the point of power, when you have these initiatives that are done by men. It's a patriarchal power, and claiming to give women freedom, it's not. Patriarchy cannot give you freedom. It can only use you to access a certain position and to entrench itself in power. And Winnie Byanyima really, really hones on that, the fact that it was one of the clearest strategy that worked in Uganda for this government, and the fact that Museveni has been in power for over 30 years. Women have been a big part of his constituency. Like, it's very difficult to beat him in that constituency because people think he gave them power. But when Winnie Byanyima reflects, he tells you it was a clear strategy to reach out to women and entrench yourself in power. And that was how you were going to win. And that kind of government cannot give women full their rights. And indeed, our constitution, which was enacted in 1995, was very progressive, because there were very many women in that parliament that informed it. But it's not the women that are remembered for the work they did, because it was always about get women to believe that the man gave them power. So I am very suspicious of state-funded kind of women empowerment, feminism, because unless that state is feminist, unless it is feminist in principle, in composition, what they're giving you is not freedom. It is not liberation. They are just using it because it is the kind of right of language. When you go to the UN, you can say, oh, I have 68% of parliamentarians. But they don't tell you that those women do not even ever dissent from the official position of the president. They do not. What matters is that in the reports, they are shown as progressive. And that's the kind of problematic measure of women's liberation we have currently, because it's so, like, the data can deceive you about what power is. Have the amount of women, 68% of parliamentarians, for example, in Rwanda, does not guarantee you that women have progressed. It does not reflect what much power those women come along with. And I have that experience with the Ugandan situation, and being here, and Museveni still takes women's votes after 30 years because he gave them freedom.
Thank you so much for that answer, Rosabel.
Can I just add? It will be very quick. It's just to add on to what Rosabel has said, because definitely tokenism as a strategy in the women's rights movement is just terrible. And to be honest, if there's one thing I've constantly, which is a conversation that I have mainly with young feminists, is to actually be very careful of that, because the system does that. As soon as they find out that you're a bit loud, that you're a bit, you know a few things here and there, and you might be able to cause trouble. One of the things is also to just make sure that you are dependent on that very same system that is abusing you. And the fact that we are constantly seeing the same people on these panels, you know, on the UN panels, on whatever. We are constantly hearing the same thing, when all of us know that there are so many young women on the ground doing a lot of work, you know, that is not being highlighted and their voices are not being heard. And because most people, as soon as you are given that position, you are just grateful to have it, because that's the trap of tokenism, is that you become grateful that you've been given a position that is rightfully yours. And then you lose your voice to actually make space for anybody else, because at the end of the day, if you misbehave, that position will be taken. So I think definitely, Rosabel, my God, yeah, I definitely think when it comes to movement building and thinking about feminism, tokenism in the women's rights movement has been, to me, it's a huge curse, where you basically think that you're making a lot of moves when in reality you are just excluding people and basically putting home guards that are going to protect the same interests of the same system.
Thank you so much. We're running out of time, so I think I'll end the question and answer session right there. I'm going to give the speakers a chance based on what they've talked. I know you talked about a lot of different things, but if there's like a takeaway point that you'd want to succinctly point out really quickly, now's your chance. If not, that's also okay, but just so you have that, you know, you have that chance to.
Yes, there's Dinah here. So today is 16th June, is the Day of the African Child. And as we have this conversation, it's important. I mean, you can immediately situate it within what's happening with the girl child and what's happening with the boy child. Our struggle is to break barriers, break glass ceilings and all of that, and get us to get out there and occupy our spaces. It is also very critical that in this work, what are the things happening with our sons, our brothers, and especially a young generation of males. Girls, we are also working with boys to change the mindset, the patriarchal mindset, this mindset that makes them feel entitled, that makes them feel that they are doing women a favor, but adhering to some of the things we are calling for. How do we strategize in such a way that we do not miss that opportunity in all of it all, such that we are at the stage where women and young girls know what their rights is and know how to claim it, but we're still struggling with those people who originally felt that they owned the world and the world was structured around their needs, that they do not have an understanding of where all of this is going. So I know it's a very tricky thing that when we're talking about women and women empowerment, we're not going to cede off opportunities that are meant for women off to men. But then it's important that how do we bring up young boys in our societies? The whole bit about working with boys and men to ensure that women's rights are fulfilled, I think it's a conversation we should have and strategize around it so thoroughly and so meticulously that we do not miss that opportunity, that we are way ahead and some people are still struggling just to understand fundamental issues around women's rights and their own rights as people in society. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can I just say like last words if I go? I think that it's very important when we talk about organizing to have a certain way to evaluate whom have we organized with and for, because there are different ways of organizing. Whom are you organizing with? Whom are you organizing for? And are those constituencies overlapping? Are they the same every year in, year out? How are you adding new voices to the people you are organizing with? Because this whole dichotomy of saying I am working on behalf of victims, you're not organizing with them, you're trying to speak over them. And how do we interrogate our own power in organizing that you're not speaking on behalf of people whose lives you are not even privy to? Whether you look at urban versus rural, how rural women are looked at in the movement as if they are less than for urban women who are there to just speak on their behalf. We have to interrogate that. And without what we call peasants, the peasant movement was very instrumental in upstaging colonialism. And without that, in the feminist organizing, we cannot win. Because, for example, I live in Uganda, 80% of women live in the rural area. And majority of Uganda is young women under the age of 24. So how are you organizing in ways that are well known and organizing with, not to go to the village to say, I take a few pictures for the donor. That is not organizing, that is you taking advantage. How do you critically see how are we organizing with, how are we succeeding power to the people and leave people to tell their stories and empower and give them the connections they need to be on the same platform as we are. I think for me that is very important. And the other issue is when you talk about what has come to be men's rights and the rise of opposition to women's rights in this continent is very, very critical. And we see it very at the heart of the state organizing. We have states like Tanzania, we have states that are already, they are still in opposition to even the few rights that we thought we had had. We have to recognize we live in a very difficult time where even the small rights we had are being eroded by people saying, oh, but you've made it, you women have everything. That kind of language is very, very, very disruptive in the way that it gives a very false idea of what women have. Yet when you look at the realities that women, we are nowhere to liberation, and the men's rights activists where it say, oh, the boy child is being left behind. But that's not the reality. The reality is that equalizing looks like oppression. And that's what we should be looking at. We should be looking at how are men interrogating their privilege and bringing up speed young men to recognize that we are all equal, and no one is going to wait for them to recognize that the women are already doing their work. They're already doing that work to liberate themselves, and therefore men should do that work. So for me, that is very important to look at as we organize with looking at young men and young boys. It's very important to be cognizant that we are far away from guaranteeing women's rights. Instead, a lot of the rights are being still eroded right now.
I think for me, my final point, and I think again, Roswell has touched on it, it's on also personal accountability. And I think Audre Lorde talks about the personal being political. And I think it's extremely important as feminists, even as we talk about all these ideologies, that we are, when our lives are examined, when our lives are looked at, people can be able to say that, you know, we are living the principles that we are talking about, that we are not just, you know, preaching, and these principles actually can't work. So I am all about us sitting down, and when we talk about things like horizontal leadership and no hierarchies, I'm all about us practically starting organizations and actually adapting those things and showing people that it can work. And I think we need more and more young feminists need to, and are taking up space and basically showing people that, you know, these models that you thought were a utopia actually work, you know. And I think those are the stories that we need to tell, because constantly what patriarchy has done is pushed back and told us that what we are proposing does not work. And if we continue talking and we don't adapt the strategies, the things that we say we want, we end up with the whole conversation of, oh, you are your own enemy, or, oh, we need, as we are saying, we basically, because anybody that is a feminist knows that feminism doesn't exclude. So I don't even need to talk about boys' rights. I don't need to talk about men's rights, because the kind of ideology I adapt does not exclude anybody. If our feminism truly lives up to what we say it is, it's not exclusionary, you know, it's not. And if my feminist feels exclusionary to you, it's also for you to question why. Are you bothered by the fact that your privilege is being attacked, or what really is happening? We need to negotiate. And every time someone says that they're excluded, we also need to question whether it's privilege that is speaking, or it's truly that our principles that are excluding them. So for me, living and you showing, even in the different, and that's why I'm saying, even in the different spaces that we occupy, because most of us who are on this call are privileged. There are so many privileges that have made us be able to have this conversation. And the question is, in the space that you are sitting, what are the feminist principles that you are applying that are actually working and are effective? And those are the ones that, according to me, you have authority to speak on. Because if someone comes, you can be able to say, okay, I talk about X, Y, Z, and here it is. This is how we've adapted it. This is how it's working. And this is how we can model the future after it.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for that. So do you want to give a last remark before I close the discussion?
Sure. My final reflection would be around ownership. Why it's relevant to document local lived experience, whether it's from our personal history, our national history, or whether it is authentically documenting stories from the present, is all about owning that resistance not as feminists coming in from somewhere foreign, but something that exists from the spark of consciousness that is actually established within and amongst those within the local context. And with ownership comes a sense of accountability to the ideology that you are actually living, whether it's at an organizational level or at an individual level. And I think that ownership to the feminist ideology, that ownership of feminist resistance is really relevant for movements to grow and thrive wherever they may start. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A huge thank you to the four speakers who have taken their time today to come here and share with us their experiences and their expertise and all that they've kind of learned so far in this organizing journey. I think this is particularly important for me because spaces where we encourage learning and relearning are so important so that they give us a space to evaluate, right, and be more effective, which is another word that kept being mentioned a lot, that are effective in that our initiatives are actually serving those we say that we're trying to serve, as much as we're organizing with the people, the right kind of people, like that was mentioned as well, that our personal ideals are actually reflective of our physical spaces and the environment around us. And I to speak to myself, I feel like I've learned and relearned and will take all of this discussion, and I urge everyone to as well, and kind of evaluate their space in the feminism world and how the feminism can be of better service. So thank you so much. Thank you also to our audience that has joined us today. Thank you to everyone that has commented, that has asked a question. We have a comment from Abigail Bergensen that says, please reach out to the African Women's Development Fund whenever you feel ready to apply for a grant to promote your work. That's the African Women's Development Fund.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to leave it to Stigmata to conclude our discussion today.
Colleagues, friends, brothers, sisters, thank you for making time to participate. Speakers, thank you so very much for sharing. You know, I am one of the person who is coming out of this conversation very happy today, because this conversation started to haunt us since 2018, as I said. And we had said, yes, we need to have more narrative out there about what is happening in the continent. And for us, philanthropy is not about money, it's about intellectual giving, it's about service, and this is what you are doing. But also, we really need to balance the story of information which talks about practices and models of giving in the continent. Because what is said is not said by us. So it is told to suit the frames of different people. And you have concluded here that you know, if we are not careful, we will produce an information which will continue to privilege the frames and ideology of the patriarchal systems. So we really need to adopt to the right tools, to adapt to the right technology that is going to really help us to drive and generate more and better data to help us tell the story which is going to really represent the African feminism at the center of it. The question mainly was, for us, we really need to see more voices of feminists out there, but what does it really mean, African feminism? And we have always asked ourselves, how can we organize and find different ways to make sure that we are truly working towards liberation as African feminists? But I think we have agreed here that that is a challenge that we are all going, we are taking away with us. There is a growing involvement and influence of African feminism, but that has gone largely unrecognized. Why? And these are the conversations we're having. We say the impact of African feminism is underrepresented, it's understated. Why? So I think those are the questions we need to take with us. But the research shows that I think one of the, maybe the area we need to look at is that especially African feminists often seek deeper level of engagement and connection with the cause and with the cause that they're supporting, and less think about what is the impact. It remains less clear what are the bolts and nuts of African feminism. How does it operate? Who sustains it? What challenges it encounters? But this group today of speakers started to unpack these questions. These questions are big, are huge. So and also we have realized even before that there are very few platforms for peer learning, for reflection, for volunteering, that are really helping to build these skills, which are very, very essential, skills that our education systems does not give. So we really need to nurture more platforms like this Africa Philanthropy Network and any other platform that will provide a space for reflection, bold reflection, asking difficult questions, reflecting on what is it that we should do to sustain African feminism, because we believe that that is the way we can only transform the social challenges, the complex economic challenges, the complex any challenges you want to mention, by really transforming and putting the theories and tools and practices of especially African feminism at the center. I'm talking about African feminism because that is all what I know. All what I know. So I think what I want to say is we are here as APN. The aim is to really reclaim the power that is in everything that we are doing as Africans, as women in the continent, who have a lot of responsibility to transform the lives in this continent. Different aspects of life that I cannot even mention. The list will be too long for me to mention. So we are here to seek to recollect that voice, to claim the practices, various practices, and these 4 practices that have been shared here through the tools and different techniques and strategies are going to be part of the story that we are telling. In the end, I just want to conclude by saying, truly, 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 it is the time now to tell our own stories. No one else will tell our own story. But also we need to construct our own narrative. No one will construct our own narrative. We have the champion. 4 of us, you guys, 4 speakers today, and our moderator are the champions. So take the lead. Take us through the reflections, the learning, the sharing, so that most of us are able to understand, because sometimes it's an issue of understanding, but also it's an issue of culture. You have spoken about all this. Take us through the movement, and we'll try to adapt. In the final analysis, we really need to build strong and effective communities that are striving to build equitable and just societies in Africa. And without putting feminism at the center, it is difficult to achieve that. That is not me who is saying. It was told to me by over 200 philanthropists who attended APN assembly in 2018. So colleagues, participants, I thank you so very much for attending. Speakers, I would really need to ask for your 5 minutes stay back when others have left. But for sure, we are going to share with you the recording from this conversation, and we'll be very happy to take further this conversation because it is required, and it is required now. I think what every speaker told us is that now more than ever, there is a need to amplify feminist voices. We have taken that and we are on it. Thank you again, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
So if Sophie, Rosdor, and Diana, if you could just stay for 5 more minutes, just really quickly. Thank you.
Okay, we can go ahead. The 13 people.